Hello and welcome to Tech Deal's game performance stock versus overclock on a Ryzen 7 1700X with an RTX 2070 graphics card, 1080p high detail, 6 games tested, live gameplay and built-in benchmarks. How much of a performance jump do you really get with overclocking your CPU these days? This is a recent $1,000 build that I did on my channel, Ryzen 7 1700X, 16 gigs of RAM, 480 gig SSD, 500 watt power supply, RTX 2070 graphics card. Yes, half the budget, 50% of it went to the card, but it really is worth it combined with the value of this CPU. That's an amazing value for the money. Now, this video is all about game performance and stock versus overclock, and can you play modern AAA games at reasonably high frame rates on a Ryzen 7 1700X. Stock out of the box, this processor has an advertised 3.4 gigahertz clock speed. It advertises a turbo speed of 3.8, but it's really never going to get there out of the box. That's single core, lightly threaded applications. In reality, stock performance is 3.5 on all the cores. When you have a load, when you're gaming, when you're editing videos, doing content creation, multitasking, 3.5 gigahertz is what to expect on a 1700X out of the box. For those of you curious, a straight 1700 out of the box is 3.2. An 1800X is 3.7. A 2700 is 3.7. And a 2700X is 4.0. Those are the stock all-core turbos out of the box, but they can all be overclocked. Now, I have this installed on an Asus X370 Prime Pro motherboard. It's a first-generation board, but it's actually a really nice board with a 10-phase power delivery. It's why I used it. At the time, it was a really good deal, $99 after mail-in rebate, and it's got great features, high-end ALC 1220 audio, Intel LAN. It's a nice board. The first-generation X370s, at least now in November of 2018 when I'm filming this, remain a good deal. For how much longer, I can't say. These are not likely to last very long, but while you can get them for the current low prices, they're worth considering. Now, I'm about to show you split screen, side by side, game performance, stock, which is 3.5, and then overclocked, which is 4 gigahertz. I have a 120 millimeter liquid cooler in here, not a 240, a 120. I don't normally advise a 120 millimeter liquid cooler for overclocking to 4 gigahertz. I'd normally say 3.8. For the most part, it actually ran just fine at 4.0. It was not 100% stable in Blender and Ada64 stress testing, but it was stable in all the games that I threw at it, and I've played several others, and I've messed around with it for about a week or so since I built this machine. And in gaming, it's stable at 4 gigahertz. But in Blender, it did hard freeze the machine. At 3.8, it was rock solid stable in everything. Ada64 stress test, Blender, video encoding, everything at 3.8 was perfect. 4.0 was just a bridge too far, at least for those kind of tasks. But for gaming, it worked just fine. And as you're about to see, the temperatures were quite reasonable. One question some of you may have is, what BIOS settings did I use to get 4 gigahertz and were they stable? 4 gigahertz was stable in gaming. It was not stable in Ada64 stress testing. It did fail that. But in all the games that I've played, the 6 I'm going to show you here and more, it was completely stable. It just, when put under an artificially high stress load, it simply didn't pass. I went into the BIOS. First thing I did was turn on XMP, DDR4 3000. It's $99 Team Group RAM, worked perfectly first time, no big deal. And then I set a 40 multiplier. It's based off 100, so a 40 produces a 4.0 gigahertz clock speed. I did not adjust voltage. Voltage was left on auto. I did play around with voltage, and the short answer is when I tried to set it lower to like 1.35, the system was simply not stable. So I had to leave it on auto, which does run it up pretty high on this board. But as you'll see from the temperatures in just a minute, the temperatures aren't too bad. Now, whether it's worth overclocking is a different conversation. We'll discuss that at the end of the video after we've shown you all the gameplay. Before we get to that, linked in the video description below will be the link to the playlist on this computer. Go watch the first build video if you'd like a detailed look and a comparative analysis of the pros and cons of the components that I used. That video was more than 25 minutes long, and I get into the pros and cons of graphics cards and power supplies, cases, RAM, etc., and give you some alternative options. That playlist is down below. All the parts used here will be linked down in the description below to Amazon and Newegg. Those are affiliate links. If you want to buy anything that you see featured here, if you use those links, it does support the channel at no extra cost to you, and it'd be greatly appreciated. Nothing in this build was sponsored. Not a single component that actually ended up in this build was provided by any company, so this is 100% on me. So your support is definitely appreciated. And with that being said, let's get on with the benchmarks. First up, we have Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Now, this is a built-in benchmark. Some of the ones I'm going to show you in a minute aren't, but the benefit to a built-in benchmark is they are reasonably consistent. Now, Assassin's Creed Odyssey's minimum FPS is not, but its average and its max generally tend to be. You can watch the real-time numbers at the top of the screen provided by MSI Afterburner. There's a video on my channel on how to make it look like that. If you are interested, just search my channel for MSI Afterburner. By using a built-in benchmark, you can see the exact same scene at the exact same time with the exact same performance numbers. Notice on the left-hand side, we have 3.5 gigahertz or 3500 megahertz, and on the right-hand side, we have 4000 megahertz or 4.0 gigahertz. Notice that the temperature is higher at 4 gigahertz. That's because it's overclocked. The voltage is higher, the clock speed is higher. We're running about 10 degrees C higher. Notice the frame rate is not dramatically different. This is going to be a reoccurring theme throughout this video. It is also worth noting that the graphics card usage is not at 100%. So we were actually CPU limited in that test. But even being CPU limited, we still have the same average frame rate and the same max FPS. The minimums are weird. The minimums actually were lower on the 4 gigahertz overclock, but the minimums vary wildly and are not stable from run to run in Assassin's Creed Odyssey. So ignore those. I'm including them just because thoroughness. 83 and 83 FPS, overclocking made zero difference. Our next game is Far Cry 5, and this one actually does show a difference. I'll show you the chart in just a second. Taking a look at the real-time performance numbers at the top of the screen, notice that the graphics card is not 100% utilized. It's not even 90% utilized. Notice that the graphics card here is not the limit to performance. What you are watching is the absolute frame rate that the Ryzen 7 1700X CPU can produce at 3.5 and 4 gigahertz. When you are in a CPU limited environment, when you have plenty of graphics card, yes, overclocking will make a difference. Yes, you will get more performance, but only once the graphics card is no longer the limiting factor. Rerun this same test at 1440p Ultra, and then you wouldn't see a difference. But here you do, because the graphics card isn't the limit, the CPU is. Again, just like the last test, notice that the temperature of the overclocked CPU is comfortably higher than stock. But you do get more performance here. How much? 9%. 91 frames per second stock to 100 frames per second overclocked. I would like to point out for those of you playing the home game that both of these numbers are insanely playable. The minimum FPS was 71 and 78 and the max was 123 and 135. None of these numbers are slow. So by not overclocking your CPU, you have a minimum frame rate of 71 and an average of 91. This is very, very playable. Or 78 and 100 if you overclock. But this is running at 1080p high detail with a $500 graphics card. If we replace the graphics card with an RX 580, these numbers would be much closer together. Now we're taking a look at Ghost Recon Wildlands, sort of the predecessor to Far Cry 5. It's sort of Far Cry 5 without being Far Cry 5. Open world, lots of fun. Notice that the graphics card usage is much higher here than it was in the Far Cry 5 benchmark. There's going to be a consequence for that. Our frame rate is going to be much closer together because even though we're overclocked, even though our temperatures are higher on the overclocked CPU, there's really no difference in the frame rate. Watch this in real time. Look at those numbers. The overclocked one might be a frame or two higher here and there, but then it goes below here and there. They are very, very similar. 1080p, high detail. We are mostly limited by our $500 RTX 2070 graphics card. That's pretty remarkable. So if you're running at Ultra or 1440p or at 4K, then frankly overclocking your CPU doesn't make any difference. 102 to 103 average, 91 to 94 minimum, and max didn't change 116. So again, our $500 graphics card was the limit at 1080p high detail, which also means that at any higher detail or any higher resolution, that graphics card will continue to be the limit. Next up, we have Shadow of the Tomb Raider, the third installment in the reboot of the famous Lara Croft franchise, or Lara Croft, take your pick. Again, the graphics card is our limit here. Take a look at the performance up there, 97 and 98% usage respectively. The temps are noticeably higher, almost 15 degrees higher at times on the overclocked chip, but notice the performance is not improved. Again, the graphics card is the limitation, not the CPU. Now, I tested Shadow of the Tomb Raider when the i9 launched, the i9-9900K, but I used an RTX 2080 Ti graphics card to do it. And in that situation, with that much graphics power, more clock speed and more CPU performance made a difference. If I were to take the Ryzen 7 here and swap it out for an i9 with this $500 card, there'd be almost no difference. There would be a small difference because the i9 has some optimizations and software tends to be written for it, but not nearly the performance difference that I showed in my i9 review, which is why whenever I talk about high-performance CPUs, the first thing I always say is buy a better graphics card. If you're going to put money into your computer, I would rather have an RTX 2080 Ti and a Ryzen 7 1700X than an i9-9900K and an RTX 2070. The 2070 is going to bottleneck the i9 in basically any game that you're going to play on it that deserves such hardware, whereas the reverse is not true if you're running at higher resolutions. Now, if you're playing at 1080p high, then a Ryzen 7 1700X would, let me be clear on this, would bottleneck an RTX 2080 Ti. But if you're playing at 1440p, ultra-wide, high, 4K, then no, it wouldn't. At higher resolutions, your graphics card is so completely going to be the bottleneck to performance that what CPU you have doesn't matter nearly as much. This doesn't mean you can run a 10-year-old CPU, mind you, but anything reasonably modern is going to be sufficient at high resolution and high detail settings. So which is bottlenecking which, CPU or graphics card, depends entirely upon what game you have, what graphics card you have, what resolution you're playing at, and what detail setting you're playing at. Now, in this final sequence of Shadow of the Tomb Raider, there has been a performance difference. Notice the graphics card is not being fully utilized. Notice, however, that we are comfortably over 8 cores. In fact, we're at 60, we're using 10, 12 threads at the moment. So modern games like Shadow of the Tomb Raider absolutely will use an 8-core CPU if you have them. It doesn't use all of the hyperthreading, or SMT as it's called on Ryzen, but it certainly uses some of it, and it's absolutely using all 8 of your processing cores. Some people were surprised when I put this computer together with the RTX 2070 and said, oh, come on, man, you're going to bottleneck that machine. Well, yeah, 1080p high detail a little bit, but I'm willing to bet a lot of people aren't playing at 1080p with this nice of hardware. Either you're playing at Ultra or you're playing at 1440p, in which case then the graphics card is a great choice. 112 to 113 average, 88 to 88 minimum, and 194 to 193 max. Basically, Shadow of the Tomb Raider at this detail setting with this graphics card doesn't care whether you have a 3.5 or a 4 GHz CPU. A 5 GHz CPU would not make a difference. You need more graphics card. Go to higher resolutions, and then no amount of graphics card is going to make a difference. An RTX 2080 Ti at 4K is going to run the same on a stock 1700 or an i9-9900K. Next up, we have Overwatch, and Overwatch is an interesting title because this hardware is technically way overkill for Overwatch, and you certainly don't need an 8-core 16-thread processor to play it. Take a look at the CPU utilization, and it's worth watching this video twice, or at least the game benchmark portion. Watch the numbers in the top of the screen twice. Look at both sides, look at the CPU usage, look at the GPU usage, see what's actually being utilized. If the graphics card's not being utilized, then your CPU is the fallback basic limit to performance. If the graphics cards are fully utilized, then more CPU won't make a difference. At least those are rules of thumb. Some games have built-in limiters, some games are simply engine limited. There's an exception to every rule. But We are playing Overwatch at 1080p high detail. No resolution scaling is in there. It does go in automatically. I did make sure to manually remove it. You have to go into settings because usually it sets it to like 141% resolution scaling when it detects you have hardware of this power level. So resolution scaling was set to 100%, and then I made sure that everything was set to high and not, messing around with the various detail settings, because sometimes it plays around with the sub settings and you do have to check those in Overwatch. Now, Overwatch has no built-in benchmark. I am playing 2 games here. These are against bots, medium level detail, because I was testing this early in the morning and sometimes getting a random match takes absolutely forever. And testing against bots is perhaps maybe a little more consistent than testing against real people. I only mention it simply in the interest of full disclosure. Now, if you look at the performance numbers, you're going to notice that you can't really track them in real time, frame to frame, across the 2 benchmarks. These are different maps, different battles, there's different things going on, but there's a lot of stuff going on. I am playing in D.Va in both of them, and I died on the left side. I am playing in D.Va on both of them, and it's as similar an environment as I can realistically make in a reasonable period of time. It is not directly comparable, but it's the best I can do, and it does show you what happens when you play with great hardware. Another thing it shows you is that an RTX 2070 is not crazy for Overwatch. Now, you can set the detail lower and get higher frame rates on lower-end hardware, but notice that our graphics card is basically fully utilized. We are just over 100 frames per second playing Overwatch. No, you don't need this level of hardware to play Overwatch. I've benchmarked it and demonstrated on a wide variety of hardware, but I thought I would include it because it's a popular game and you can all see how well it does. 106 to 114 average, and then 80 and 108 1% low. Do not put too much stock, no pun intended, in these numbers. Different maps, different battles, different benchmark lengths because the battles ran slightly different lengths. These were benchmarked using MSI Afterburner's built-in numbers, which is how I got a 1% low here. Basically, the game runs really well regardless. Stock overclocked makes virtually zero difference. You can overclock it, but you really aren't getting anything in Overwatch other than perhaps higher temperatures on your CPU. Next up, World of Warships. Those of you who know me know I love this game way too much. I've played it across an incredible amount of hardware. It is, frankly, my current main favorite game that I play. Now, I am a World of Warships community contributor, but this has nothing to do with that. It's just a commentary because you should totally check out the Tech Deals gaming channel, and I have a bunch of World of Warships videos over there. I also live stream it on Twitch. Not as much as I used to because I'm busy with the YouTube channel lately, but that'll come and go over time. Follow me over on Twitch, link down in the description below if you are interested in that. But this is a free-to-play game that is just way too much fun. If you are a fan of naval combat, World War I and World War II, cruisers, destroyers, battleships, and aircraft carriers, this game is absolutely awesome, and I cannot recommend it enough for a ton of free fun. Like any other free-to-play game, there's a million tons of ways to pay money in this game, but you don't have to. You can have hundreds of hours of fun for free without ever paying a dime. But this is not a review of World of Warships. I'm just excited and enthusiastic about my favorite game. That sometimes frustrates the heck out of me, which those of you who watch me live stream know, but that's online games in general. So we are watching 2 different battles. Just like Overwatch, I cannot make them exactly the same. There's no way to play the same battle doing the same thing. Now, I did take the same ship, and I played these back to back, and of course I try to make them as accurate as possible, but you can't pick your map, you can't pick your battle, and I would love to sit here and spend 4 hours playing trying to get exactly the same battle results, but that's not an efficient use of my benchmarking time. That's live streaming time. Maybe I'll live stream benchmarking one day and then we can spend all day doing it and, you guys can see the background of that. I might do that in the new filming studio once the new benchmark room is set up. It's almost there. It's coming along very, very, very soon. So, taking a look at the real-time numbers, I want you guys to notice something. 1080p high detail, our RTX 2070 is bored. This game does not need a 500R graphics card. Our Ryzen 7 1700X is bored. It does not need an 8-core CPU. We are, however, CPU limited. Sort of. Kind of. Not really. That reminds me, something else somebody's bound to say in the comments down below. Wait a minute, World of Warships is limited to 75 frames per second. It's got a limiter in the engine config file. Yeah, I disabled that. Take a look at the averages up there. At the moment, we're running 92 and 98. Those don't hold, by the way. More combat is coming, but I disable that. I go into the engine config and set it to 299 to make the FPS run as fast as it wants to, so don't worry about that. So we are CPU limited. And for those of you looking at the CPU usage percentages, 10% at the moment, remember that World of Warships really only uses 2 cores. It occasionally dips into a third, but usually it just uses 2 cores. I really wish some of these game companies would, because you get games like Shadow of the Tomb Raider, which will happily use an 8-core CPU, and then World of Warships, which only uses 2. A Pentium G5400 or an Athlon 200GE, the new Zen-based Athlon, those are 2-core, 4-thread chips. Those would be giving you exactly the same performance right now. If you put the same graphics card in here, you would get exactly the same performance from those $60 chips as you're getting from this CPU. This is also why whenever somebody says, will X graphics card bottleneck Y CPU, or will Y CPU bottleneck X graphics card, my answer is always, it depends. I should trademark that response. And the reason being is, it depends upon what game you're playing, what resolution you're playing, what detail setting you're playing. This absolutely would perform at the same frame rate you're watching right now with a $60 dual-core processor, assuming it's a relatively modern one. I'm not talking about a Core 2 Duo from 10 years ago, but a reasonably modern dual-core processor, preferably hyper-threaded, would perform exactly the same that you're seeing right now. Shadow of the Tomb Raider would not. Throwing more graphics card at this would not improve the performance. Throwing more graphics card at Shadow of the Tomb Raider would. What would make World of Warships play faster? A faster CPU to a point would. I do play this on Intel systems when I live stream. I have an i7-8700K. The clock speed is faster than this. But truth be told, the game doesn't run much faster. It sort of runs at the speed that it runs. And considering that it's naval surface ship combat that runs at these speeds, Rainbow Six Siege, this is not. 144 frames per second required is not. Even, it's not even World of Tanks, which a higher frame rate in World of Tanks can be nice. That's more of a twitchy game than this. This is a thinking person's game. So, I've shown you enough World of Warships. I think you get the point. 85 frames per second average stock versus 86 frames per second overclocked. 46 and 49 at the 1% low. Again, this was benchmarked using MSI's built-in benchmark. And the results are not totally comparable because, after all, they're different battles and different battle results, but they were the same ship, and World of Warships is pretty consistent, all things considered. So there's some results for you. Again, just like Overwatch, don't take these to the bank too much. 2 different battle results would produce slightly different numbers, plus or minus one way or another. But all things considered, is the increased temperature, is the increased power consumption really worth it for World of Warships? No, of course not. Well, there you have it. 6 games, stock versus overclocked, and overclocking the Ryzen 7 1700X to 4 GHz for gaming is kind of pointless. Yes, I understand some people have a psychological attachment to the 4 GHz number. 3.5 sounds low, 4 GHz sounds faster. Yeah, it does. Except for Far Cry 5. Did you really see any difference in those numbers? It really doesn't make much of a difference. Your graphics cards matters more. And I'm not using some $200 RX 580 that's really a 480 plus here. This is a $500 graphics card at 1080p high detail. This should be demonstrating the CPU power, and it was in a couple of situations, being the limit rather than the graphics card. Shadow of the Tomb Raider isn't going to run any faster, no matter how much graphics card you put in it. 100-ish frames, 110 frames per second is all you're going to get out of that game on this CPU. Whether you run at 3.5 or 4 doesn't change that number by enough to matter. In my opinion, put a Hyper 212 LED for $25 on this, leave it at stock settings, and have amazing performance for the money. Right now, before Black Friday, when I'm actually recording this CPU is on sale for about $150. That is a phenomenal value for the money. It's not going to last long at that price, and I would take this over any of the other Ryzen CPUs at this price right now. You can overclock if it makes you feel better. If you want to see your benchmark chart be that much longer, by all means. But in the real world, it really doesn't matter. Put your money and your time into your graphics card. That's where it really matters. Like this video if you like it, share it with your friends if you love it. Remember to subscribe to my channel with that big, huge red button directly below. Questions, comments, thoughts, feedback, suggestions, and ideas for new videos, put those in the comment section below. And as I said before, check the links in the video description. Those will go to all these parts on Amazon and Newegg. As I said before, this is not sponsored, and none of this was sent to me by any of these companies. I bought and built this entirely by myself, and your support would be greatly appreciated so I can do more of these types of videos. Thank you so much for watching. I will see all of you next time.